Delighted to turn this session over to Phyllis Seeley and Dustin Solomon.
Thank you very much, Allison, and welcome everyone. My name is Dustin Solomon. I'm the Instructional Effectiveness Specialist for Baker Online in the Center for Graduate Studies.
And hello, and my name is Phyllis Seeley. I'm the Instructional Effectiveness Specialist in Owasso.
While we are beginning the presentation, we do encourage everyone to introduce themselves on the chat box. If you could share with us the division or program that you teach in and the campus that you teach on, it would be great to see where our audience falls today. So today's session, as it says here, is coaching faculty on creating good discussions. And the objectives for today's session are going to be focused on recognizing questions that foster critical thinking and encourage student-to-student interaction within the classroom, and helping coach faculty on how to facilitate the dynamics of class discussion, whether in the classroom or online. So with some of the presentation, we'll be focusing on coaching opportunities, but also to provide the background knowledge that is necessary for you to be able to have a quality discussion with the faculty that you're coaching on implementing good quality discussions with students in the classrooms. We want to make sure that we point out the alignment here with the faculty growth and evaluation process, because that's how we all become involved in a coaching dynamic with our faculty. And really today's presentation focuses on two components of the faculty growth and evaluation process, and that is planning and preparation as well as learning facilitation. When we jump into discussions, you're going to notice that we have a focus of our discussion around the idea of planning for discussion within the classroom, and then of course learning facilitation, because classroom discussions do focus on facilitating learning and reaching the objectives, as well as implementing assessment within the classroom. So we're going to begin our conversation focusing in on the idea of questions and discussion. A quote here to begin to reference our conversation: the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. In that same light, a discussion begins with one good question. And so before we move forward with the discussion, think about why we ask questions, or why do instructors ask their students questions. And you can share via audio, or you can type your response in the text box. But why do you feel, or why do you think that instructors ask their students questions? So Stephanie says to get feedback. Okay. To find out what they already know, to promote learning the student learning objectives. Lena says multiple purposes: guide students to further thinking in a certain direction, probing for knowledge, checking for understanding. Okay. So go ahead and continue to add if you're currently typing. But so there are lots of different purposes to questions within the classroom, as everyone is pointing out. Helping to diagnose student understanding, engaging with students to keep their attention, to reinforce participation, reviewing, restating, and emphasizing or summarizing important information, stimulating conversation within the classroom, helping students to retain material and put things into context. These are all reasons why instructors would ask their students questions. And so when we're thinking about discussion within the classroom, it's important to think about what is our intention or our reasoning behind that. And another consideration that we want to make is, can we have good, effective questions and develop them on the fly? And when we think about that, we really want to think about the difference between, similarly, the differences between these two pictures. When we are developing questions on the fly, we may be asking good questions. There may be no argument about that. However, we may be moving in a direction that is not getting us directly towards our objectives or where we want to end our class session or our class on in the most efficient manner. And so questions can be developed on the fly, but if teachers want to be, teachers want to be intentional about trying to achieve the learning objectives for a specific class session or the learning outcomes for the course, then they should be very mindful and intentional about the questions that they ask.
Well, Justin, you know, I was doing a little bit of research leading up to this WebEx and came upon something by Jane Baxter out of DePaul University. She was doing a workshop entitled Classroom Discussion is a Skill, Not a Technique. And she was very emphatic that instructors must help students understand that discussion is a skill that must be learned, like any other skill. And she went on to say that good class discussions often start with the instructor communicating the purpose of the discussion and what exactly constitutes a valuable addition to a discussion. She goes on to say that we need to coach or encourage our instructors to explain to students that discussion is a skill that will be useful in their careers. And, you know, as instructors, we also want to encourage them to maybe take a look at their students, what their majors are, what areas they're going into, and that doesn't take a whole lot of time and effort.
No.
And because, you know, then they can, again, reemphasize how useful discussion is in that one particular career. And this is a learning skill, again, that we can emphasize to our instructors that will serve our students well into their future. And this is a great place to practice that skill. Another area that I was looking at is there's a textbook by McKeechee called Teaching Tips. And I also took the opportunity to check Amazon out on this in case you're interested. This book ranges anywhere from about $27 to I think around, I don't know, $70-some, probably depending on if it's paperback or hardcover or used or whatever. But it's a great book, as I was telling Dustin, because it really talks only about the college classroom, which is great for us because you know, many times a lot of the strategy and technique textbooks are geared for, I don't know, junior high, high school, and college, but this one is, I think, especially good. But McKeechee goes into some reasons why he believes that students do not participate in discussions, and I think as evaluators out there and also as teachers, we've had many classrooms where it's very difficult to get students to start participating. He mentioned some reasons why he thinks this is going on, and some of them: boredom, as you can see on the screen, lack of knowledge, general habits of passivity, cultural norms, and the very biggest one, he says, the most compelling is a fear of being embarrassed. And I'm not sure, you know, maybe some of you have some comments on this. He also goes into some detail as to maybe how to curb this fear a little bit. If you've had this happen with some of your discussions in your classrooms and you are maybe honing in the idea that fear is a big reason maybe why discussions aren't taking place, how have you curbed that? Could any of you, you know, give us some of your suggestions, and then we can also talk a little bit about what McKeechee is saying. Okay, I see some students lack self-esteem. Allison, thank you. or no, is that from Allison? Yeah.
You have the book. She likes the book.
Yeah. Thanks, Allison.
Oops.
Oops, we lost our screen. I guess I'm done. But, well, you know, you can just, you know, put up your ideas if you want as to how to curb this fear that some students might have. McKeechee goes on to say things like, for example, maybe help students get acquainted with one another. And I know we often, as instructors, do icebreakers at the beginning. And I guess maybe we could encourage our instructors to, you know, I don't know, maybe do more than just one at the very beginning of the class time, or come up with some ideas as to maybe get students to get to know each other a little bit. Maybe be inclusive and welcoming in your classroom. Make that very intentional. Maybe stand at the door and just say, hi, how you doing today? How's that new puppy? Or whatever, you know, getting to really know the students is important. Number one, or very close to the top of his list, was getting to know the names of your students. And I guess we'd be probably very surprised that just something simple like that might help those students with this fear of talking in class to kind of get over it, you know, recognizing you or the instructor as a human being. Something else to remind your instructors is to maybe, if possible, arrange that room so that students are looking at each other. You know, that might be one. We have something else here?
Yeah, we have some suggestions here. Charlie Johnston says provide a supportive learning environment that is low risk for the students. Kim Poeg says add discussion communication to one of our SBK courses. Can we teach students to participate? Lack of participation is linked to lack of preparation. Good point, Kim. Harold says to show interest in what students have to say. And Bill Livingston says he experiences that there's less fear online because students don't have to worry about things like appearance, how they look or sound, and whether they can come up with ideas spontaneously. They can't hide. Okay. And Catherine says students can answer questions in small groups. Excellent suggestions. And Lena agrees with Bill. And another strategy is to make the questions relevant to the student's life and work. Those are some excellent strategies.
Wonderful participation. Thank all of you. That last strategy is also one I think McKeechee mentions as well, is that if you get to know who those non-participants are, if you can try to get to know them a little bit better, it might make it easier for them, or for you, or for the instructor, I should say, is to understand why they're not participating.
Yeah.
And again, that's just that whole idea of building relationships in the classroom.
And that participation piece is always an ongoing struggle in any teaching setting. I mean, that's been my experience my entire duration of my educational career. And so as a coach, you have an opportunity to have that kind of that list ready, like, okay, well, you're getting low participation. Have you tried this? Have you tried this? Let's think about ways that we can rearrange our classroom. Let's think about ways that we can make students more comfortable. Let's think of ways that we can integrate opportunities on the discussion board for students to get to know each other, or are there additional supports that we can put in? And so as everyone kind of shares their ideas here, what's really valuable in a setting like this when you're taking these sessions with other coaches is that everyone probably has at least one strategy that they can bring to the table and recommend, and you can all share in those strategies and borrow those strategies when you're working with your own faculty members in your divisions and programs. Okay. So when we begin thinking about the discussion within the classroom, teachers should kind of think about themselves as guides for the instruction. And so they need to think about being active and proactive about questions that help guide that classroom discussion. And so when we think about this, kind of some of the behaviors that teachers need to have in the forefront of their mind is their ability to correct and redirect students' misconceptions, using students' responses and questions as a springboard to additional questions and discussion, redirecting the classroom discussion to keep it on topic, using questions to test assumptions behind their reasoning, and encouraging students to elaborate on responses. Our faculty that we work with, the guiding discussion piece of the discussion is more of a reactive stance, but the proactivity comes in when instructors actually begin to think about, well, what kinds of questions am I likely to get, and what are some ways that students can, or some resources that I can provide for students to kind of redirect them back. Most people who have taught a course more than once, the same course more than once, they tend to get a general idea of the misconceptions that the students are going to have, maybe based off of the materials that they're engaging with, some lack of clarity in those, or just maybe some general misconceptions about the topics that are being discussed. And so keeping that in mind, we can coach our faculty members by getting them to proactively plan for those types of questions or misconceptions that they're going to have when they're delivering that content. And so just something to point out to your faculty as you're working with them.
Okay. I think, too, another area that maybe we can talk with faculty about is the designing of the questions and how we go about doing that. And some faculty just may, need your assistance with that whole sequence. Pointing out to them, and I'm sure they're, well aware of the SLLs of the course they're teaching, but sometimes they're not maybe thinking about using those as a springboard. For each learning outcome, as the screen is saying, have them create a question or two, or work with them in creating a question or two, and then working backwards. It'll all, when answered, when these questions are all answered, they'll lead up to the very first key question that you designed. Of course, using Bloom's taxonomy to guide your question design is important as well. One other coaching hint that I might offer is to have faculty consider using or inserting some open-ended divergent thinking questions into their lecture notes as a reminder to ask those particular questions at certain times during the class period. For one thing, it certainly breaks up the lecture. It doesn't take very long. Maybe you could ask students or a suggestion for an instructor might be to insert a minute paper, for example, into their lecture notes, so that when the instructor gets to that particular part in the lecture, there's a reminder there, in his notes or her notes to stop lecturing and let's get a little participation in the class going. And again, a minute paper doesn't take very long, and even by the time you get some of those responses read back to you, maybe 5-6 minutes is gone. The minute paper could also be used as a sharing thing. They could write for a short time and then maybe ask them to share their ideas with who's ever sitting next to them. Another thing is, if you're asking students to write something down, for those students who have trouble talking in class, they can read their response, and sometimes that makes it a little bit easier for them. Justin's going to talk a little bit in the next slide here about the Bloom's taxonomy, and we think it's a really important strategy to use for designing questions that will encourage in-depth conversation.
So remember that we're thinking about our questioning in a backwards design way, we're thinking about the learning objectives. So by the end of the course, I need students to be able to do this, you know, X, Y, and Z. And so really start with that and think about how can I get my students here? How can I get them to that point by the end of either this week, this seminar, or the entire course? Using that information, we can kind of determine which level of Bloom's taxonomy that student needs to achieve. And having the understanding and the knowledge of your particular program and thinking about where your course falls into the scope and sequence of that program, for example, is it a 100-level overview course in which they're just going to get a basic knowledge? You know, in those cases, we're probably not getting to a really high level of Bloom's taxonomy. However, if it's a 200, 300, or 400 level course, or even higher for our grad faculty, you know, clearly they're going to be getting to those much higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, the analyzing, evaluating, and creating. And so really thinking about that and thinking about how do I need to structure my questions, or what questions do I need to ask to get my students to that place by whatever deadline I'm talking about, the week or the seminar or the entire course. And helping faculty understand this dynamic and helping them think about the idea of designing discussions by scaffolding them and allowing the discussion questions to build on each other as they kind of climb up through that hierarchy of the taxonomy. And then using that level of taxonomy and, you know, pulling out from, everybody should have this from AIM training, the Bloom's taxonomy verb, question, and strategy document. And, you know, if you happen to have misplaced it between now and whenever you completed AIM training, just a reminder that it's on the ETNL website, just throwing that out there. But pulling that document out and looking at how, what type of question or what verb you can use within that question to ensure that you are aiming for that particular level of Bloom's. And designing your questions in that way can help you actively prepare those students to achieve that SLO. And so, again, going back to our kind of our reverse thinking of it, we're starting with the learning objective in mind and using that to plan out the discussion questions and identify which strategies we can implement with students and help them climb up to achieve those learning objectives.
All right, I am sure that all of you are familiar with the different kinds of question structures as they're listed right here: closed-ended, open-ended, convergent, and divergent questions. The closed-end questions, I know that we, as far as getting a really rich discussion started, probably closed-end questions are not the type of questions that we want to ask, although they are useful for maybe checking a quick comprehension, as I'm sure all of you are aware, is maybe an example of formative assessment. So we want to, if it's discussion, rich discussion that we want to create, we probably want to stay away from that type of question. The open-ended question, actually, you're probing, you're trying to expand their thinking and processing of information, and I think this is probably the type of question that we want to try to create for really rich, deep learning. Convergent questions, maybe again not so much because they really are going to be, we're looking for one right answer. Students are required, typically they're just sort of regurgitating a certain response based on either a reading or perhaps a lecture, something that they have seen or experienced. Divergent questions then have multiple possible answers, and sometimes these can be really uncomfortable for some students because for many years, that's all they've known is either the closed-end questions or the convergent, like there is a right answer, and I don't know if I know the right answer to that, and they get a little nervous about that. But I think the more opportunities we can give students asking students this type of question that really will expand their knowledge. It'll help them work in groups. Students will have the opportunity to learn from other students, and maybe to even for the first time in maybe a lot of their years of school, be listening to another side of the story. There are some coaching hints that maybe you can discuss with your faculty. One that I ran across is to maybe ask your faculty member to invite a colleague into their classroom, or you, and ask that person to focus on the way you ask questions and the kind of questions you ask. Maybe answering questions like, did my questions generate answers but very little discussion?
So you're recommending that they ask somebody to come in and observe them while they teach?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Or you could just, you're talking about the evaluator or about that faculty member.
To ask them to pay attention to what kind of questions they teach.
Right, and just, jot down, whatever that, instructors, is the questions they're asking at the time. Or maybe you could even suggest to the instructor to tape, if they feel uncomfortable having someone there, they could tape their class session. And then I think it's really important that not only do we do this process or suggest this, then instructors do this process, but they have to take a look at what was some of the evidence? What happened? What were some of the questions? Did you ask as many questions as you thought you did? And, were your questions closed-ended? Were they open-ended? Were they intellectually stimulating? Or were students just regurgitating information from the textbook, maybe? And maybe you ask questions that you didn't know the answer to, and that's okay. Dustin and I were talking about that, and, sometimes those are the questions that really stimulate good discussions. So it's important that, that we take a look, or have somebody take a look at what we're doing, and if we can encourage our instructors to take on that mindset. You can volunteer yourself as the evaluator or the coach to come in, or you could just say, if you've got a colleague that you'd like to invite, if you feel comfortable with somebody inviting them to come in, and just jot down a few things. So it's important then to take a look at the evidence. Maybe one question wasn't very stimulating, but it doesn't mean that you have to throw it out. Maybe just you need to tweak it a bit. Okay?
So Phyllis is going to talk here about characteristics of effective questions, but I just want to point, as we look at the next two slides, understanding the characteristics of effective and ineffective questions is really important from a coaching aspect, because we want to help want to help instructors understand those characteristics, and we need to understand them ourselves, because as for example, if an instructor invites you in to, give them some feedback on the questions that are asked, whoever's going to give them that feedback needs to understand what those characteristics are, so that they can provide them that feedback.
All righty. So as you can see on the screen, some characteristics: meaningful and understandable. Well, of course, that is extremely important to students, that they understand exactly what it is that you're asking, and that it has a meaning to what they've been studying and what they've been discussing. Depending on the level of comprehension of a topic, students may be able to handle different levels of difficulty. So you probably need to think about that. You want to challenge them, but not have it so difficult that it frustrates them. Students benefit from being able to answer easy questions before the more difficult ones. So, I guess get them feeling comfortable about coming up with some very plausible answers, so that you can kind of set the stage for maybe a deeper thinking question. The other slide here that we're going to look at is more again on what can make questions ineffective, the other side of the coin. If you've ever been in a classroom, or maybe you've been either as an observer or maybe as a student, when students aren't sure of what is being asked, they will not attempt to answer it, and that's point number one here, being too vague. Or maybe the question is too loaded. Students are thinking, geez, I don't know, I think maybe I'll guess at this one, rather than, telling you what it is they actually think about something. And asking the question, does everybody understand? Are there any more questions? Again, another conversation that Dustin and I were having. So often I hear faculty will come back and say, I don't understand, the scores on this assessment were terrible. And I ask them, do you understand this? Did anybody have any questions? Nobody had any questions. I thought everything was fine. So, students are going to be a little hesitant, raising their hand and saying, I don't understand.
And not only that, but, students aren't going to know what they don't know. I mean, a lot of times this is new content to them, and they may think they get it in class, but when it comes to actually answering a question, that may be the time when they realize they don't know it. And in some cases, it's too late.
Exactly. So maybe instead of asking, does everybody understand, just do some formative assessment. Ask the questions that you're hoping that they understand. And then the last one, of course, the yes-no questions or closed-ended questions. These, again, can be useful for maybe reviewing newer or the previous knowledge of materials, or to get started on a new topic. But they're pretty much a dead-ended question for discussion.
Yeah, they're going to be very limiting in terms of taking that to the next level. You do have the opportunity, as we kind of looked at the concept of guiding discussions. You can take their responses from a yes/no question and use that to springboard into another layer of questioning. But in terms of having that be a starter for a really deep discussion, you're probably not going to get there. So at this point in time, before we go on, does anyone have, when we think about the idea of facilitating discussions within our classroom, do any of you have techniques or strategies that you would use in getting a discussion started or keeping it moving within your classroom? Feel free to type them into the chat box, or you can unmute your microphone and share them.
Well, we can, if you're thinking, continue thinking, of course, and, just write those in the chat box. Some of the strategies from our AIM training that you might want to remind faculty of as you're coaching them. Debates. You can have debates, and that certainly would be a strategy for getting some discussion started. Think, pair, share. I think we're all familiar with that, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Write, pair, share, or small groups, 1-minute papers, we mentioned before, different classroom response systems. And then my question again is, if any of you are thinking of anything else that maybe you've used, I think we do have some response.
Lena shared, start with 1 or 2 easy open-ended questions to help students warm up and then proceed into more difficult. Give context to questions. That's excellent. And some of you have mentioned some of these strategies in earlier comments. I know that somebody mentioned working in small groups to encourage discussion. So, but Phyllis, you said that you had information for us on Think, Pair, Share.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's important that we like I said, that think, pair, share was one that I looked at more carefully. And again, you know, it doesn't take very long to actually get started in running one of these think, pair, shares. It helps students, I believe, for one thing, develop this community of learners. It can also motivate students to, I don't know, engage more that may not have, you know, maybe engaged in a larger setting. They can maybe engage a little bit more with a partner or two. The entire class on a think, pair, share could be involved. Maybe you're doing a lecture, and for some disciplines, a lecture, I mean, there's nothing wrong with a lecture. As I said, we just certainly don't want to just make that our total format. But to break up that lecture, as I said a little bit earlier, a think, pair, share doesn't take very long. It allows that quiet student to answer some questions without having to, you know, stand up in front of everybody. It also helps students, I think, in using some good listening skills, as well as some of their discussion skills too. It is probably a very effective and popular technique to use with really big classes, and I'm sure you can understand that. Anybody have any comments on or any experiences you'd like to share with think, pair, share?
Well, we did have two additional suggestions. Stephanie pointed out that they use case studies to help students with concepts that are taught. And Stephanie, I'm going to assume that maybe that's the case studies are used in class discussions, and that's kind of the method for delving into them. Kelly also suggested a strategy called walkie-talkie, having students write their thoughts on paper and then take them to the end of the hall with a partner and share their thoughts. And then Harold said that he's used focus group forums. One group of students are the executive team, the other group is the consumer group. So those are some excellent strategies.
Good. All right. All righty. Here are some tips that maybe we can give to faculty members. And again, I think Dustin talked about this a little bit beforehand, is developing your questions beforehand. That is really, you know, planning ahead of time. Having students write about the question or the idea. And again, it gives them, I don't know, maybe more of a positive level of being comfortable in the classroom discussion if they can maybe read off of their paper their response. And again, questions or tasks may be assigned to small groups. Questions may be given as a part of a previous class homework assignment. And again, that gives them that stability of knowing definitely what they're going to say. State discussion questions as problems or real-life situations. And I think some of our audience Dustin have already alluded to that, as, you know, real-life situations really make a big impact. And again, I think many instructors, I know I am guilty of that, is that little wait time thing. You know, you almost you get nervous when you don't have an answer immediately. But again, that's one thing I think we can really help our instructors by coaching them about that wait time.
Absolutely, absolutely. So another way to help encourage discussions within the classroom is to develop norms around how discussions kind of evolve within the classroom, or help the faculty member kind of develop their own norms. Just like encouraging them to think about wait time, teaching them to have that kind of that internal programming that causes them to stop and maybe count to 5 before they move on with the discussion. but helping them develop and identify discussion norms for their classroom. And so helping them model effective interaction within the classroom, helping them to learn how to watch for clues with students in terms of who wants to share, who's going to go next, or even thinking about who already has talked. I mean, I've gone in and I've observed faculty members teaching before where it's almost as though they're having a discussion with one or two students in the class rather than the whole class. And so helping them to prevent one or a few students from monopolizing the entire classroom discussion. And then if students' responses are incorrect, offer something like, you know, that's interesting, what makes you say that, or could you rephrase that, helping them to, rather than just saying, no, that's wrong, and, you know, shutting that student down, helping them continue that narrative, that dialogue, so we can get them to the right place. And then also, and this is something that a lot of instructors are really uncomfortable with, disagreement in the classroom. And disagreement is okay. Disagreement is how we discuss things and we flesh things out and chew on them. But sometimes disagreement can lead to really heated discussions or arguments. And we really want to welcome disagreement because of the level of conversation, the level of knowledge that it brings in. But we have to phrase it and contextualize it and think about it as an academic behavior. That it's a debate. You know, somebody mentioned using debate as a strategy. A disagreement is a debate, and sometimes those get heated, but we need to focus back. We need to keep it focused on the topic. And so those are just some suggestions or some norms that you may want to encourage faculty to acknowledge or recognize, and then help them to communicate those to students.
You know, one other thing, Dustin, that I might just add here is that we were talking too earlier about asking those questions that you cannot answer. Not the ones you don't know the answer to, but the ones that you cannot, nor can anybody answer because maybe the information hasn't been discovered yet.
Right.
And those sometimes are some of the most exciting conversations you can have in the classroom. These are, you know, students will maybe think about possible ideas or a possible solution, and this is sometimes a real invigorating way of getting discussions going, and it should not be something that an instructor feels badly about if they can't answer that question.
Yeah, they don't have to know everything.
Right. All right, in wrapping up our discussions, whether it be at the end of the class period, or primarily, I guess that's mainly what I want to talk about is at the end of the class period, we want to make sure, as stated here, like a fine essay, a fine discussion should come to a fine ending. We don't want our discussions going maybe full shot, and all of a sudden we hear a lot of packing up, you know, backpacks being open, books being closed, and you know, the discussion kind of just is, you know, I don't know. We haven't reached an end, and all of a sudden students are getting ready to leave. That's why we want to make sure we keep a really a good idea of what our time frame is, and so that we can come to an ending. It doesn't need to be the end of the discussion. Maybe we didn't finish it. We can finish it tomorrow or the next day, or like Dustin suggested, we put it up on the discussion board, continue it.
Yep. And so Phyllis, it looks like you have here some suggestions for how faculty can wrap up discussions.
Right, and for example, review what we've just done. What are some main ideas? And asking students that you don't need to be the person giving all this information. Maybe ask for, you know, okay, so what did we decide? What did we talk about today? What were some of the main ideas? Did we reach a conclusion? And maybe assess the effectiveness of the discussion. In that way, you know, did a lot of people talk? Or was it just you and 2 or 3 other people? Maybe it wasn't you at all, or very little of you, and that would be good.
That would be ideal.
Ask students to write you a brief note. Sometimes they would rather do that, I think, commenting on the day's activities, and of course collect those and keep them and refer to them. I think we also as coaches need to encourage our instructors to reflect.
Mm-hmm.
It's important for discussions, future discussions, to be productive. And by reflection, here are some questions. How many students participated? Who did not? And we might want to look at those who did not. We can't all of a sudden jump to the conclusion that they weren't prepared. That's just the way they are. Maybe we just need to get to know that student a little bit and find out why they didn't. What was the tone of the discussion? Was it respectful? Did you have to step in a lot of times and calm things down, or was it just really stimulating? Ask your students for feedback, as we mentioned earlier. Have them write that little note to you. And did you accomplish the goals that you set forth?
Yeah, and I think as coaches, the biggest thing in terms of wrapping up is just to get faculty to realize that just because everybody stopped talking doesn't mean that the discussion's over, and that just because class is over doesn't mean that everyone understood the discussion to be over. And it's really important to learn how to masterfully bring conclusion to a conversation. So often we can kind of get carried away with the conversation, or, I mean, maybe we, as the instructor, we thought the conversation was over, but no one communicated that to the students. Something that we try to coach our online faculty members with is, just because the seminar ended doesn't mean that the conversation was ready to be transitioned. So you really have to be mindful of how you begin conversations, but also how you end them, so that you can give that sense of closure to your students with the topic.
And the very next time Dustin and the class meets, maybe that's your starting point too. Is anything that anybody like to say about Monday's discussion?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
And so as we kind of discuss the idea of these discussions, we want to think about how these dynamics translate to the discussion board within Blackboard. Online, of course, has been working with the concept of online discussions for quite some time, and we now are fortunate enough to have the discussion boards being used across the entire system. And so we want to kind of begin this section as we move towards the end of our presentation about, what's the difference, or is there a difference between these face-to-face classroom discussions and online discussions. And it may or may not surprise you that a lot of the components or direction for this particular presentation came from what we refer to as our discussion board best practices. That we in the online division have kind of abided by and used in our structuring of online discussions for quite some time now. And so really the response is that there isn't a difference, it's just a difference in environment. And so when we look at the translation of our face-to-face discussions to the discussion board, we really have some great opportunities for utilizing the discussion board in a couple of different ways. When you're using it with a face-to-face class, in conjunction with that, you have the opportunity to use the discussion board to begin the classroom conversations. So you're starting the conversations before students even arrive. And it can be a really great opportunity to aim for those lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy so that you're not spending class time reviewing really basic information. You're getting them to begin to discuss that information before they come to the classroom, so you can kind of quickly review it and then get into the deeper, much richer levels of Bloom's taxonomy. You can utilize it to introduce topics that will be discussed and build that background knowledge again before they get there, reviewing pre-discussion questions. And then as Phyllis and I were talking about the idea of getting to the end of a class session, but the conversation isn't over, you have the opportunity to take that discussion to the online setting to continue it. So adding threads to your discussion board to provide some follow-up thinking to what was discussed in class, to aim for higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So maybe inside of class you reviewed, some lower levels, some more basic information, and you have the opportunity to provide a discussion online that encourages students to aim for those higher levels. And this is a really great opportunity when you think about those students that kind of sink into the background. It gets them to engage at a higher level that they may not do in a face-to-face setting. This also allows you to keep the momentum going so you don't feel that lag or that drop in between class sessions. Because, it always seems that between sessions, students kind of forget what you were talking about. They kind of lose their passion about it. And that ties into linking other session information. So bridging that gap of time and space between classes. So again, you're not losing the momentum, you're not losing the topic, you are connecting them with the use of the discussion board. And those are all opportunities that we can coach faculty on. A lot of times, or several times, I've been invited to meet with faculty on other campuses and discuss with them the idea of discussion board best practices and strategies for using the discussion board in their face-to-face setting or in conjunction with it. And we always start off the session with a couple ideas, but by the time the session's over, we are generating lots of great ideas of how that discussion board ties in and our classroom discussions can take place on there. A lot of times people think of it as two very different behaviors and actions, but the reality is the only thing we're changing is the environment.
Yes, and I was just wondering if our audience had any feedback they'd like to give us as to maybe how they've used the discussion board in relationship to their face-to-face. If you have anything that you'd like to share with us, that would be really interesting, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to see it. Or hear it if anybody wants to unmute their microphone and share.
Because we do have some time, a little bit.
Also, this would be a great time if anybody has any questions about any of the content that was presented. We are at the end of our presentation, so feel free to ask any questions or share any comments. Your own strategies that you've tried and found to be effective and successful, or even ones that you have tried and haven't been successful. We can learn from those too. We'll just give another couple seconds of wait time. Kim has shared privately, I think it would be beneficial for adjunct faculty, for our instructional design team and content experts to add discussion questions to the UBD formatted curriculum. Yep.
Good idea, Kim.
But you also have a great opportunity to take those and translate them maybe to online as well, and kind of develop questions based on the way that your classroom conversations go. Harold has shared, I typically leave a question in the discussion board each week for my accounting students. The question asks, what were your learning moments and what was most difficult? And Harold, does that help to generate some really formative discussions around the course topics? Great. And that's also a great opportunity for faculty to see where students are with their learning and to jump in when you see that they're struggling.
Stephanie has one too.
Stephanie shared, using rubrics to guide students and expectations works well in our program. Okay. And Stephanie, does the rubric focus around the discussion board or around assignments?
It actually focuses on both. It tells them what the expectations are as far as you can't just put something like, yes, I agree, you have to expand upon it. And it also gives them guidelines on how many times they have to participate in order to get full credit.
Okay. So it's really setting those expectations for their own presence.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Excellent. And that's something that we don't have kind of across the system is, you know, a single expectation for that sort of presence. And I think that as we get more experience in the online setting, that's going to be something that's going to become a little bit more apparent, obvious, and prevalent. Okay. Well, if you have anything, go ahead and continue to share. But Phyllis and I do want to thank you. These are conversations that we really enjoy having with faculty. That's why we are very happy to sign up and offer this session today. Here's our contact information, and do feel free to reach out to us at any point in time if you have any questions related to the content of this session or would like feedback on how to coach faculty, some suggestions, or anything like that. We're always open to being contacted and having these sorts of discussion with coaches and with faculty members.
Again, I want to thank you, too, for joining us today. I am very impressed with the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We had great sharing, and we appreciate that very much. We all learned from that.
Absolutely.